Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Contemporary Issues. Nice to have you here today, and Zoomers here. We're going to talk about Abe Lincoln today. So it should be really good. Lots of hundreds of thousands of books have been written on Abe Lincoln, haven't they? And he's a never-ending, interesting figure. And 7 years. Right. So that'll be good. Reminds me also, you probably saw in the news about Jimmy Carter's going into hospice care. So prayers for Jimmy Carter. Yeah, okay, good idea. Ron and I got the big voices, so we can project. We will do that. We were just talking about Jimmy Carter being in hospice today. So our prayers are with Jimmy Carter. I wish Jimmy had Zoomed his Sunday school class. Just thinking about that this morning.
They say he taught for 4 years.
For 40 years, he did a Sunday school class, and I read that buses, like 3 or 4 busloads of tourists would come every Sunday to that little church just to hear him. He drew more people, of course, than his pastor did. In a sermon. So, and so
Pat and I have been to the Carter Center in Georgia. I don't know how many of you had planes, but the thing that I noticed about it is that going to others, some of the other presidential libraries had an awful lot to do with the president. And the Carter Center, to my remembrance of the Carter Center, that there was almost nothing about Jimmy Carter. Almost everything was about what was going on at the time and other people and things. It was very outside of himself. Very, very.
it'll be a big funeral when he passes.
Coolidge was also real humble. Coolidge was very humble. I went to his library.
Okay, Alice asked me to say something about my wife, Vicky, who fell and broke her kneecap a few days ago. But it's kind of hairline fracture. They call it a star fracture, where it splits out in 5 directions. But the pieces are not separated very far, so she doesn't need surgery. She's just wearing a knee brace for 8 weeks. So she'll be here next week, but thank you for asking about her. Prayers for her too. Any other announcements?
Well, Steve.
Yes, sir.
Our Toronto member,
Susan.
the controversy, thank you, Susan. The controversy in Toronto right now with the head anchor who was fired because she let her hair grow gray.
Yes, that.
The latest, the latest on that. Sometime maybe we have a topic on ageism, but.
That would be good. Yeah, we saw that, Susan, a lady news anchor that had been there for decades, and as soon as she let her hair go gray, they fired her.
Wow.
So. That's to be very fair.
Right, very, very popular and been around for a long time, Lisa LaFlamme. And she was picked up automatically by other outlets. So she hasn't suffered, but it was a big deal. And actually there was a big shakeup as a result in the management, and some people got fired.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing that. Okay, any other thoughts before we talk about Honest Abe? Okay, thank you, Ron, for doing this. Let's do it.
Okay, well, the main source we drew on, by the way, of course, tomorrow is President's Day, so I think it's appropriate. Also, I'll put in a plug for a lesson I'm going to do in a couple weeks on Frederick Douglass, probably the most well-known black man figure of the Lincoln era. But today we draw heavily on John Meacham's book, And There Was Light. This has been on the bestsellers list in the last 3 or 4 months, both regionally and nationally. And of course, John Meacham appears on TV quite a bit. He's written many a good book. In fact, I want to reread the one he wrote on Thomas Jefferson soon, but I highly recommend the book. I thought Meacham did a good job of looking at Lincoln, not only just looking on Lincoln, but how did his actions impact the nation and the world and the culture and society. So it really opened it up, not just focusing on Lincoln the man, but the broader context of what he did and how it influenced America and the world. It's a good book to buy.
Did it begin in New Salem then?
Even before that, yeah. Also, I want to mention, I've had the privilege of hearing word for word the entirety of the Lincoln Douglas debates. There were like 6 or 8 of them, and you're going to say, how in the world could they have captured word for word the 1858 debates that went 3 or 4 hours apiece? There were at least 6 or 8 of them. How could they have done it? They didn't have recording devices, and the answer was they had the Lincoln Douglas debates in Illinois in 1858 drew so much attention that national journalists went in and attended every one and used shorthand. And I guess the good people, journalists like Steve, knew shorthand so well, they could take a 3-hour speech and capture it. And by the number of people they had, by having 8, 10, 12 journalists there all doing shorthand, they were literally able to construct every word of those 2 debates. So if you want to listen to something, Richard Dreyfuss speaks for one, is the speaker for one of them, but you can hear the whole debates. And I thought listening to this a couple of years ago gave me a good insight into Lincoln, hours and hours. The fact that he could speak extemporaneously or nearly extemporaneously on the stump for 90 minutes at a time, uninterrupted. Shows his linguistic.
Where did you get that?
This is available from Amazon.com. I'll pass it. I'll pass both these
Like
around.
everything else.
You can get everything. Also, another thing, we'll touch on it. For those that haven't seen the movie Lincoln, I highly recommend it.
Yeah.
Daniel Day-Lewis plays Lincoln, and this is quite historically accurate. I highly recommend it. It's a good movie from both to entertain you and to make you think about moral values, et cetera, et cetera. I'll pass that around as well.
I think it's on Netflix also.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Okay, well, let's get started. Touch with a cartoon. This was on the internet. I don't know, many of you probably saw it. This is St. John's United Methodist. I don't know what city. Live your life well, so we don't have to lie at your funeral. I like that. That talks about living and I like the other one too. That's it shows Colonel Sanders at the pearly gates. There's a couple chickens there, implying that chickens are quite renowned there at the pearly gates, and he's saying, "Uh-oh." He's not looking forward to his judgment this evening. So next one. Okay, we're going to touch real quickly on, as we talk about Lincoln's morality, his religious basis, and his basic core values that almost all historians say were extremely high. He gets rated in almost all popular opinion and historian scales as being #1 president in terms of his values and commitments. So we'll quickly blitz on origins of morality. There's the nativist view, and that says moral knowledge is built into your mind the minute you're born. Some think it's preloaded in a God-inscribed heart. In other words, that the Holy Spirit has put into your conscience, your mind, a preloaded conscience of some degree, or the evolved moral concept from Darwin that says beings, human and animal entities, learned morality as a way to promote the survival of the group. Altruism. And so most feel there's some combination of these two. Others believe that moral nature comes strictly from nurture. That we're largely a moral blank slate when we're born. That's one view. And then there's rationality. Kids figure out morality for themselves when their minds are ready and they're given the right kinds of experience. Next slide. Perhaps the person that's considered the greatest child psychology is Jean Piaget, Swiss guy. And Piaget had the theory of cognitive development. And he taught that morality grows in 6 progressive stages as you grow up. And justice is pretty well understood by age 5. And we learn it mostly from interacting with other kids. And he said that after puberty, abstract thinking is well developed. And some children begin to think for themselves about the nature of authority, meaning of justice, reasons behind the laws, and obviously their religion. Next slide. Okay, so moral growth. A gentleman or a lady named Kohlberg found that the most morally advanced kids were those who had frequent opportunities for role taking. In other words, they played with other kids. Sandbox 101, you learn in the sandbox, you don't kick over the other kid's sand castle, you share the little rubber ball. You don't throw sand in their face, you say kind words about their creations. And kids learn to put themselves in the other person's shoes, and it's looking at problems from that person's perspective. So a lot of our meism is broken down as we interact with other kids when we're young, and that goes a long way, they found, toward developing an inner moral character within us. So find a good sandbox to put your kids in. He also found, Kohlberg, that egalitarian relationships, such as with peers that have a hierarchical thing, don't do as well a job as creating morality. It's more important to get that interaction and experiential growth of your morality instead of having a parent, point at you. Don't you? Yeah, that plays a role. But he said that interaction is just so key. So let's jump to Abe Lincoln again. What was the essence of Abraham Lincoln? Was he great because of his good looks, his great wealth? Or he held up Bibles all the time? No, none of the above.
You know what he said about his looks? He said if someone called him two-faced, and he said, if I were two-faced, would I wear this one?
Good one. But there's one of the earliest pictures of Lincoln. They found the picture taken at the Gettysburg Address, and one lady put it into a good computer and blew it up like 20 times, went into the one small sector of the photograph, and they figured out that that's Lincoln there at the Gettysburg Address. He kind of is the center of attention, and they know that the leader usually stands near the flagpole. We also want to mention the picture. He had several law partners, but I think this gentleman was named Brandon, who will make some comments on the next slide. Next slide. At about age 40, Lincoln is going along in a carriage talking to his law partner, William Herndon. And Lincoln really opened up to Herndon about his childhood heritage. He was quite concerned and embarrassed about many aspects of his heritage. And here's some of the things we know. Lincoln's grandmother, Lucy, was charged by a grand jury as being half prostitute.
What's that mean?
This is. But then his mother, so his grandmother was considered very loose. And his mother, Nancy Hanks, was the illegitimate daughter of Loose Lucy and a well-bred Virginia farmer. So both his grandmother and his mom were kind of, pretty sexually active. And then Nancy Hanks, that's a reconstructed picture. They did not take that photograph of her, nor did she sit from an artist, but she had I believe a sister who they said looked almost exactly like her. And so the artist constructed the picture of what we think his mom looked like pretty well, which is there on the upper right. Okay, Lincoln's father was a very poor, uneducated guy. As about a 6-year-old in the early 1800s, he had witnessed out on a farm field, his father violently killed by an Indian. And I think it was his brother who rushed into the scene with a rifle and slew the Indian.
Brother. The dad's brother or Lincoln's brother?
I'm not sure. We'll have to read the book more. But he, at any rate, this is Lincoln's dad
Okay.
that witnessed the, not the death of, Lincoln's dad,
Okay.
but yeah. He saw, his father saw his grandfather killed at a very young age. It was orphaned, was left in poverty, was a very uneducated man. There was also a story, here's your Peyton Place. There's a story that Nancy Hanks, that's Lincoln's mom, was impregnated by a man named Abraham Enlow before her marriage to Tom. Enlow insisted the story was true. Many people in the neighborhood said, yeah, it was true. And Hernan was told Abe Enlow was as low a fellow as you could find. So we don't know. We don't know if his father that's legally shown as his father, Thomas, is his true father, or this other gentleman, if you want to call him a gentleman.
Yeah.
Abraham Enlow was his father. So Lincoln was a bit embarrassed and confused by this heritage. It wasn't a perfect one, but he obviously turned out darn well. Next slide. Allison and I had a chance to go to this site in Kentucky, near Bardstown, Kentucky, not too far away. This was a cabin in Knob Creek, Kentucky. And it was on the Nashville to Louisville Cumberland Road. And there were a lot of slaves that were driven like cattle down this road between Nashville and Louisville. And Lincoln told the story to Herndon of, as a kid, he would see the slaves driven along the road nearby. And a couple times for lodging for the night, the slave driver would bring the slaves to the Lincoln area and they would let them sleep in the haystack. And he said he saw some terrible pictures of slave women with babies in their arms, sleeping out in the cold haystacks as they were driven in chains down the Cumberland Road. And it made a pretty powerful moral impression on him, as you would expect it would. Next slide. Again, this was in Hardin County, Kentucky. In 1800, the population there was a little over 3,600, 3,300 some whites, 325 slaves, only 11 free blacks in the area. In just 11 years later, the number of slaves in Hardin County had increased from 325 to 1,007, which was an average of 2 per family. And so Lincoln was born February 12th, 1809, Hardin County, Kentucky. His dad, Thomas Lincoln, chose to join an anti-slavery church, both there in the Kentucky area and in Indiana. The Lincolns moved from Kentucky to Indiana when he was young in 1816. That would have made him, what, about 7 years old? His mom, Nancy Hanks, died of milk sickness. The cows had gotten into some weed. They call it snake root that has trematol in it. Ingested enough of the trematol to kill her in just ingesting milk of the cow. Don't ask me what happened to the cow. But there was little Abraham and his dad and a couple other kids that were suddenly left as a widowed, and he was an orphan. What happened, his dad went off back to Kentucky and talked to a widow there, a lady that he knew, and said, hey, you're a widow, I'm a widower. Let's put our families together and try to survive. And they did. He went back and talked to Sarah Bush Johnson, widowed in 1860. She said, I'd like to marry you, but I've got a bunch of debts here before you're dead. And his dad said, I'll take care of that. He went out, paid her debts that same day, brought her back, and they were immediately married. So his dad, yeah, pretty practical, moral guy.
That birthday, same as Charles Darwin.
Oh, interesting.
Oh my gosh.
All right. So he comes up with a stepmom, Sarah Bush, Lincoln. And she was a good stepmom, he said. She treated him kindly, and she really tried to help him with his education. And Lincoln described her as a good and kind mother. Next slide. Lincoln had a passion for books and learning. He probably had no more than a year's worth of formal schooling, almost none. But he was thanks to his mom's help, his stepmom's help in getting some reading lessons at home and his hunger, he managed to acquire books. They were some of his most precious possessions. He read everything he could get his hands on. And when he heard older people speaking, he would often go back later and say, what did Uncle so-and-so mean when he said, some phrase, some syntax? He would inquire about what words and phrases meant. He stayed on that farm in Indiana, and then the family moved again from Spencer, Indiana to Macon County, Illinois when he was 22. So he did spend most of all his teenage years there in Indiana. So it was not until he was 22 that he ended up in Illinois. And he began to diverge further away from farm work. He didn't like farming. 1828, he became a ferryman on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers and made a few trips to New Orleans, which he also saw some slavery scenes that continued the impression he had of the evil of slavery. He fell in love. I think he was around 28 or something at this point. 5'2", eyes of blue. Has anybody seen my gal? He ran into a real cutie there in New Salem, Illinois. Fell very much in love. Was looking forward to marrying her. And this poor girl at a very young age died of some unknown fever. Maybe, who knows? Typhoid, whatever. And yeah. And he was quite brokenhearted. He was subject to depression and melancholy all his life. And this really tore him up very badly, as it would to anybody, I think. Next slide. Okay, his religious training. Let's look at that. Reverend Hosea Dodge, a circuit riding Methodist, married Tom and Nancy Lincoln and founded an anti-slavery emancipation church in Bardstown. So the first church he had attended with his dad was the anti-slavery church there in Bardstown, Kentucky. His mom read him Bible verses, and after church services, he would get up on a stump and almost repeat the sermon phrases and kind of oratorically act out what he had heard. They did say there was something in his father, in the faith of his father, that kept Lincoln from declaring himself a believer. And they say, well, maybe it was conflicts between scripture and putting things in practice. His father's examples, predestination, he felt was unfair, evil in the world, many of the typical things that make people wonder and doubt.
I was going to say that in that movie that you're passing around, we saw it about a week ago. And he did talk about his father in that movie, but not favorably.
Yeah, his father, when he was a teenager, would hire him out for money to local farmers, say, hey, you can have my son, he'll work for you next month. And Lincoln would come home with his wages. His dad basically took all the wages, which is what they did to a lot of slaves. You look at slavery.
Sounds like slavery to me.
Yeah. So his dad also apparently at least beat him sometimes. I don't think terribly violently, but there's such a thing as a good, easy beating. I don't know. Some of the books he read, Lindsay Burridge, The English Reader, was noted as a major influence in life. And we'll mention in a couple of weeks when we talk about Frederick Douglass, a book they both shared for moral and guidance. Next one. So Lincoln read many books that stressed individual interpretation rather than blind acceptance of tradition. Some of his favorite books were The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine, and another book by a guy named Volney. Lincoln transitioned from seeing God as a remote creator to when in the White House to seeing God as a guiding his will into mankind. So his faith did change and grow as he moved along in his life. He felt the fate of mortals was to marshal reason, experience, and faith into the ideal of loving one's neighbor. He said, when I do good, I feel good. When I do bad, I feel bad. That's my religion.
Methodist reason.
Yeah, okay. Question, things about his faith. Lincoln's friend Isaac Cogdale recalled, he was a universalist, taproot and all in faith and sentiment. James Anthony said, Lincoln was always grappling with matters of faith and reason.
What's a tap root?
Yeah.
What, Ron? What
Yep.
did they tap root? I understand universalist, but what?
I think it's the prime root on the plant.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
like a
Got it,
grapevine,
got
the
it.
taproot.
Okay.
Lincoln's friend Jesse felt he had no religious views seemed to find favor except practical and rational ones. The author who most matched Lincoln's views was Theodore Parker. And we should mention Theodore Parker here for a moment. Theodore Parker was probably the most renowned Unitarian Universalist pastor of the mid 1800s. Very renowned, a lot of formal education. But Theodore Parker, as a kid, was about to poke a spotted tortoise when he said he heard an inner voice cry out, "It is wrong." And again, this is Parker, not Lincoln. When he was a child, and he went and talked to his mom about it because he was gonna kill the turtle as a young boy for fun, and that inner voice just said, "Don't do this. Don't be an animal cruelty jerk." He went and talked to his mom, and his mom said that was his conscience, which she said was the voice of God in the soul of man. So again, Parker was a Unitarian Universalist and a very renowned one. And Parker had a dialogue with Lincoln, by the way. He was one of several theologians that had a dialogue with Lincoln. Okay, Lincoln was consistent on slavery. In 1864, said, "I'm naturally anti-slavery." And he said, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not think so and feel it. Lincoln also said, here's a theological opinion, pro-slavery theology is not the sort of religion upon which people can get to heaven. Yeah, so he took and Lincoln's law partner also noted, Herndon, that young Abe had witnessed a mulatto girl being sold in New Orleans and paraded and felt inspected like a horse. And Lincoln left the scene revolted with a feeling of deep hate. So there's no question where he stood on the issue of slavery. Okay, this is out of my wife's
Slave schedule.
slave record. She had a slave owning great-great-grandfather, Waller Holiday, who was in Spotsylvania County near Fredericksburg, Virginia. And the record showed 59 slaves. The interesting thing is all they recorded on slaves was their age, sex, and color. That was it. No name,
No name.
just age, sex, color. They were property.
What were the colors?
Black
Black or white.
or mulatto.
Okay. Okay, next one.
BW and
Okay, also, Lincoln supported democracy abroad. In the 1840s, there were many revolutions, places like Germany and several of the other European countries. And there was in Hungary, there was a famous patriot reformer, Louis Kossuth, and he was touring the United States. And America was watching the European revolutions of 1848 that challenged inherited privilege. Americans were very thrilled by the democracy movements in Europe, especially the activities in Hungary first year. Lincoln authored resolutions supporting democracy efforts abroad. And supported them and brought them forth as part of his serving as a representative in the state of Illinois. So Lincoln obviously felt very strongly about supporting international democracy. So there's my plug that Lincoln would support our helping Ukrainians.
Ron, didn't he also support the founding of Liberia in Africa?
Yes, he did. Okay, yeah. Lincoln's resolution declared that the American people cannot remain silent on democratic aspirations in other lands. And that a failure to support democracy elsewhere undermined democracy at home. So he was anti-slavery, but he was also very pro-democracy. Excellent. A quick mention of clergy. Many clergy were on the wrong side of the slavery issue. Thornwell of South Carolina preached that slave owners were the true Christians. Yeah. And then there was a guy named Manley who was a flip-flopper, 1821, an influential white Southern Baptist minister, saw slavery in 1821 as an evil under which this country has long grown. But just 16 years later, he said he argued that slavery was divinely sanctioned and should be defended out of the duty of God. Then for those that are Civil War students, of course, the Louisiana bishop, Episcopal Bishop Leonidas Polk, would become a major high-ranking Confederate general. So definitely some, quote, Christians took the very wrong side on the issue of slavery. Excellent. And of course, we've got to take a swipe at the Bible here. The Bible is not consistent on slavery. 1806 Street. William Burr produced a list of 144 self-contradictions in the Bible. Some things on slavery that are puzzling. Paul's letter returning the converted slave Onesimus to Philemon. The phrase slaves obey your masters. 2 verses from Paul in the New Testament. There's the locations of those two, talking about being obedient to your masters. And then there's the question of why was Jesus silent on the subject? We don't find Jesus's words discussing the issue of slavery. The Old Testament abounds with slavery and involuntary servitude. Of course, the churches splintered there prior to the Civil War. The Methodist Church splintered in 1844 over a bishop, a Methodist bishop owning slaves. The Baptists met in Augusta, Georgia, splintered, and of course, the large Southern Baptist group broke off there in 1845, and the Presbyterians also struggled. So the issue of slavery definitely divided the church, and we have to be fair and say the Bible does not consistently take one position on it.
That Methodist split probably created the African Methodist Church.
Yep. There's a nice Lincoln quote. During the Civil War, he said, "The will of God prevails. Great contest, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God." Yeah, and this is true, this next sentence, "Both may be, but one must be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time."
Yeah.
Well, unless you've got a different concept of God. He's a confused deity.
This is a perfect example of taking the word in the Bible, slavery, literally. Slavery in the Old Testament or in the Bible period was way different than slavery in the United States that Lincoln was so against. Way two different things.
Yeah. Well,
I
but
don't know what they mean. What do you mean?
No, they just were. I mean, slavery in the Bible, many times they became slaves, they sold themselves to someone they owed. And so they would become a slave for so many years.
that's indentured servitude.
Yeah, but they call them slaves in the English Bible.
Yeah.
And so if you're pro-slavery, you're gonna say, see, right here, they had all these slaves. It was way different than going to Africa and bringing people in chains to America and treating them the way they were treated in America. Two different things.
Well,
And it's
I
an
contend that slavery, if you look at the history of it back in Greek and Roman times, there were some horrendous brutalities
Yeah.
imposed upon slaves, putting them into the arenas and kill each other, yeah, so.
There were a lot of people from Europe that came to the US under servitude.
Exactly.
They came here and they had to spend a certain number of
7
time.
years.
7 years?
Yep.
Did they say anything about Lincoln's personal friend? In the book? He had a lifelong personal friend.
They mentioned in the book many of Lincoln's friends and associates.
Well, I'm thinking of a specific one. I can't, with my brain deteriorating, I can't think.
Our
of it.
brains.
But I'm reading a book, it's called Friends. And it's about the close confidence that these leaders like Roosevelt, Truman, they mentioned Lincoln. And this person in Lincoln's life, as he worked in the grocery store. And he didn't have a place to stay, so he slept with the owner of the store upstairs.
Mhm.
And he became a lifelong friend.
It does mention that in the book, many of Lincoln's friends, specifically though, yes, it does
Well,
mention
this
that.
one was a special friend that he kept as an advisor during his
Okay.
lifetime.
A real quick one, I call it Tempted by the Dark Side. In the election of 1860, Vice President Breckinridge, who had been ran
Right.
on the ballot, but didn't win, had at least mild pressure put on him to not certify the electoral ballot. And then, of course, there's the infamous Dred Scott decision. Chief Justice Taney ruled that black people were not citizens. Okay, on to the next one. Okay, Parker and Finney. Here was one of the most interesting things. Lincoln had letters and correspondence with both Charles Finney and Parker. And these guys were on opposite ends of the spectrum. Parker was a Universalist, a Unitarian. Finney was probably the most prominent revivalist of the last century. I'll pass this book around. But both of these Christian men from both sides of the spectrum, far different sides of the spectrum, both were in unanimous agreement and wrote and told Lincoln that he must oppose slavery. Interestingly enough, and I've read a great deal of material and sermons of Charles Finney, but Finney founded Oberlin College. And even though Finney had one of the strongest salvation messages of any revivalist of the last century, he also had incredibly progressive views on giving women prominence and a place in the church. And he caught hell for that.
Yeah.
He was also extremely against slavery. And so it was interesting. Two men of different religious tunics, shall we say, yet coming into strong agreement to tell Lincoln slavery is wrong. They were in total agreement. And Finney actually hid when there was a federal marshal trying to arrest a black fugitive up there near Oberlin College near Cleveland, Ohio. He hid a slave in his household for a couple days until they could get him across Lake Erie and free him in Canada. So Finney was a different kind of, shall we say, evangelical pastor. Next one. Charles Finney and Frederick Douglass, both strong, and Douglass, of course, was an incredibly strong Christian. We'll talk about Douglass in a couple of weeks, but both of them were very strong in calling to Lincoln to stand against slavery and do all he could. Next one. Lincoln transitioned. Lincoln had a lot of tragedy in his life, not only the loss of his
Willie, right?
little Willie passed away. And they said that really changed him. Lincoln did go to a Presbyterian church near the White House. And we'll look at the pastor of that church, but one fellow said, I sat in the fifth pew behind Lincoln every Sunday in Dr. Gurley's church, that's the Presbyterian, and on many occasions marked the change in him after the death of little Willie. They said that the death of Willie really hit him hard, and his wife very much too.
Yeah.
Lincoln believed that the world was not random and that morality, right, wrong, could never be truly divorced from politics. His chosen life. To Lincoln, people were obligated by conscience and informed by scripture and experience to pursue the ideals of love, generosity, and accountable by action or inaction. So he's got an interesting, next slide. Here's the pastor who preached to Lincoln many a Sunday at the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church there in Washington, D.C. It says Gurley's friendship with President Lincoln was strengthened when he ministered to Lincoln when the son Willie died February 20, 1862. And he presided over the funeral. Said it was the second time that his son's death had brought a preacher closer to Lincoln. So Gurley had a very positive effect and encouraged and supported Lincoln in this journey. Seward, again, I highly recommend you read Seward's book. An incredibly good man. He, of course, appears in the book Team of Rivals, the classic book that we should all read about Lincoln's cabinet by Doris Kearns Goodwin. But Seward said, we cannot in our judgment be either true Christians or real freemen if we impose on another a chain that we defy all human power to fasten on ourselves. The Constitution might allow for evil, Seward added, but there is a higher law than the Constitution. So Seward was quite the man. Next. Again, I encourage you to, if you want to spend a few hours listening to Lincoln, get a copy of that. We ought to get G's here for putting in plugs.
Yes, we should.
To sell advertising. Interestingly enough, Lincoln won the popular vote for Illinois senator, but the senators were not selected by popular vote. You had to win blocks, they called the congressional districts, and the district representatives elected.
Electoral college.
So he got beat by the, shall we call it the Illinois Electoral College for the Senate seat, but he won the popular vote. Okay, next one. Of course, Lincoln's issued the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, 1862. Incredibly important mechanism. Next one.
That was after Antietam.
Okay, and of course, in 1864, there was an election coming up, whether to see whether Lincoln would be reelected, or if George McClellan, a Union general who was a Democrat, would knock him out of the position. And it looked shaky. It didn't look, if you were a poll taker, you would have said it didn't look good for Lincoln, but some fortuitous things happened. Sherman took Atlanta. There was success at the Battle of Mobile Bay. Sheridan had success in the Shenandoah Valley. So some military successes helped swing the vote. Also, it's noted Lincoln won with 55% of the popular vote. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
And he won 78% of the soldier absentee ballots.
Mail-in ballots.
Yeah. There was crooked mail-in ballots, yeah. All right. All right, we'll wrap it up here and get to the discussion. I mentioned the movie. I highly recommend you all watch. Lincoln had to work hard to get the 13th Amendment passed. To get the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment didn't successfully pass till 1869. So it took a long while to get some Reconstruction laws passed. One more and we'll jump to the discussion. Next slide. Here's another person that should be highly esteemed in American history. Jim Ashley was an American politician and an abolitionist. He was a Republican from Ohio, and he played a crucial role in getting the 13th Amendment passed, ending slavery. So a lot of times in American history, some of the great heroes don't get the accolades they deserve. All right, so there's our light sources from the Wesleyan Quadrilateral. And finally, there's we're not going to do all those other ones. There's the Gettysburg Address. Let's get into some discussion here. Particularly, where do you think you're looking at yourself personally? What do you attribute your moral foundation? What do you think is one single thing? I think it was a combination. Was it your mother? Was it a school teacher?
Grant, I see you hand up. Go ahead. I can hear you.
My parents were definitely the influence on my morality and my thought about slavery, etc. I remember, I was probably 10 or 11, and there was a North-South football game, and I started rooting for the South. And my dad said, "Oh no, we don't root for the South. We root for the North." And I thought, "Oh, okay." So that's one thing. I have another comment that I'd like to make, and then I'll shut up. One thing that did happen as a result of the Civil War, besides ending slavery, and that is that the federal government became more and more powerful and took away a lot of the states' rights. And I know that I think it's the 10th Amendment to the Constitution says that it's not covered in the Constitution, that the states have that. And basically, I think the federal government began to have more and more influence over the states. And dare I say, I'll bring in the fact that when abortion was, the Dodds case was brought into play, what that did was it returned it to the states for the states to handle it individually. And that's the bottom reason for all of it. And that's why in New York and California, they approve abortion, but many states, and I think they've gone too far, in a matter of fact, but that's just my opinion. Oklahoma and Texas went way too far in abolishing abortion. Sorry, I brought that up, but that's just some things that
That's a good point, Grant, because they probably argued that during the Civil War, states should have the rights to allow slaves, didn't they?
Right.
Oh, yeah.
But after the war, to support his view, they garrisoned federal troops in Louisiana and some of the other southern states. Maintain the freedom.
So where did your morality come from, everyone?
Well, with me, it was my parents. And at a very young age, Methodist Sunday School, I remember my teacher, Everett Gleason. That was his name. He was a good man. In the Civil War, we suffered 600,000 casualties, which is greater than any war we've been in. Like, for example, World War II was about 400,000. And when you think about the population of the country then at Lincoln's time in the Civil War, it was a significant part of the male population, 600,000 men.
What most people don't know is 2/3 of that figure, those deaths, 600,000 were from death, or from disease. Disease, when you put all those farm boys together in those camps, 2/3 of them.
We didn't have penicillin.
No herd immunity.
other feelings, where do you think you got your internal core of morality and justice?
I have a great, great, great grandfather who fought in the Civil War from West Virginia. He died of I'd have to look at my information again, but he died of smallpox or something. It didn't have anything to do with the war or being shot.
Okay. Well, Ron, you mentioned that Lincoln's father belonged to an anti-slavery church. So that would suggest that he was an influence on Lincoln for those beliefs.
Right.
Makes you wonder if Lincoln would have gone another way if he had another parent that pushed him toward pro-slavery.
Well, as you brought up in your slides, it's important for young children to have some influence by other children in their moral upbringing. So I think parents are very important one way or the other. And my parents were important, and it wasn't because they went to any particular church at all. So it's what they taught us about what we would be thinking.
You know, my family was from the South, obviously, if you're looking at slave schedule. And my parents, my dad was a psychiatric social worker. And when I was small, we moved to Ohio. And, you know, they worked really hard not to let those, I'll say, influences that they grew up with. My mom had a black mammy growing up. And the influences, I have two older sisters, and they worked really hard in keeping away those attitudes, those Southern anti-slavery attitudes with myself and my sisters. And it wasn't until my mom was in her 90s and later on that some of that started creeping back in. I guess sometimes those influence on them creep back into their mindset. But, you know, to this day, you know, having discovered this about my family, the slavery that they held, there have been times where I felt extremely ashamed by it, and then realized I had an aunt that we visited some years ago, and she was still calling it the War of Northern Aggression. Well, that's where they were, Virginia. And the economic impact when the war hit and took all the slaves away, those farmers and whatnot, many of them were put into poverty.
Yeah.
Fortunately, my family, there were dentists and there were bankers and there's a preacher or two. So from their difficult backgrounds, they came out on top. And you know, that slavery mindset is still somewhat there, a lot of racists, but you know, and that has brought myself and our children to the point where they are lovers of all people. So, you know, families evolve, the way you think evolves. So I just have to say it's difficult hearing some stuff about slavery, but you do evolve, so.
Yes, I agree with what Alice is saying, because my grandfather, his father had maybe a slave, and he married my grandmother, who was born in Missouri, my grandfather born in Kentucky, and my grandmother was born in Baltimore, but they moved when she was a baby to Missouri, so mostly she was brought up there. And he had the attitude of a black person being a little less than she was. And she had education and was a school teacher. But her 4 grandchildren, I think, changed her mind some. My sister and I and my 2 cousins changed her mind some about where that fit in. She was moved to Detroit, and of course, there were Black folks there.
She was a good Christian, and she finally admitted it wasn't Christian to have that attitude.
Right.
Yes, I think it was because of the influence of the.
We've got about 7 minutes left. Gene,
Oh, thank you, Ron, for all the work.
Yeah.
Well, we could have an interesting one on nature and nurture.
Yeah, we could.
What I find so fascinating, it's almost like the theory of leadership here. The ingredients, the composite that was a part of Lincoln, and I think in terms of Fellmeier's sermon today, the wilderness, and then becoming and evolving. If you look at what you've given us, the way of information, Ron, the mucked up ancestry of Lincoln.
Yeah.
But numbers of people have said Lincoln had the manic depressive disorder, bipolar, that's what we call it. He also had Mary, a very temperamental wife,
Yeah.
threw water in his face, and slapped, degraded him, and assaulted him, and you have a guy who was an avid reader. At one time, he was pro-slavery. He was pro-slavery, yes, he was. But he changed his colors. But he was reading. He was also not getting just yes men around him and women, but he was getting divergent opinions. He was evolving. Sound like Fellmeyer here. He was evolving. He was becoming the kind of person who could lead us through the Civil War. Now, are those the ingredients? Nature and nurture, yes. Influences in the family, but a lot of mucked up examples. But did he learn from adversity? And in managing that chaos, that make him a better leader to deal with a divisive nation that has so many division points and so much hatred? Was he the man of the time? You know, the great man theory of history. Did this elevate him because of his life experience, much of which was wilderness and adversity? And learning how to manage that, he was better able to manage the Union and to preserve this country. You just raised a number of intriguing.
Well, to dovetail what you're saying.
What's that?
To dovetail on what you're saying, I was commenting before we started that he lost his reelection to the US Congress because he opposed the Mexican-American War and how that was trumped up by positioning soldiers on the border with Mexico in order to get the Mexicans to fire first on us. He opposed that, and so did Ulysses S. Grant. He opposed it as well.
Yeah.
Cost him
Yeah,
the
just
re-election.
an amazing person, even for us today, let alone back then when it was harder to show those personality traits.
He was the first wrestling president.
First wrestling.
First wrestling president. Wrestling. He ran as the rail splitter for the state legislature in Illinois. He wrestled.
I remember reading too that at that time, 1860s, you could ride your horse to the White House and go in and ask to see the president. And sometimes you would be able to sit with the president and plead your case for help, whatever case you had, or request. Yeah. And Ron, last week when we talked about dreams, I mentioned that Lincoln had a dream some days before he was shot that he would be assassinated. And he had the vision of being laid out on a bed, and somebody asked him in the dream, "Who is that?" And he said, "That's the president." And then a few days later,
Slide 43.
a few days later, he was killed. Yeah, just to tie dreams.
I've heard that April 14th.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, Jim.
Well, I was raised in a house that was decidedly segregationist. I was raised in Denver, but my mother's people came were always farmers or people that worked with their hands, and it was my conclusion after talking to people that they probably came over as indentured service. And I was kind of interested in that because indentured servants that came over had a term of their service.
Right.
And as a matter of fact, slavery, what I have read anyway, is that the introduction of black slaves initially was on the same basis. And then when these indentured servants started gaining their freedom and they started losing their labor, the people that relied heavily upon it said, well, we can't be having that. So they made black people as permanently indentured, and they allowed the white people to go free. I've always felt that my family's attitudes and racist underpinnings stemmed from that they wanted to separate themselves emotionally from those inferior people that had to stay indentured for all of their life, and that we were able to improve ourselves. And because there really wasn't any basis for it. My aunts and uncles were terribly, terribly racist, and they lived in the South. So they had to do it. My change came when I went into the US Army. And in the Army, in basic training, you're with people of every race, creed, color, size, everything else, you know. And going to church on Sunday morning, you're sitting in church with people that are all multicolored that way. And pretty soon it stops mattering. And then when I got out, I went to the Congregational Church, and the Congregational Church actually had literature that supported a different way of looking at the world. And I can remember getting into very heated arguments, especially with often with my mother and father, but with my aunts and uncles, it was really powerful. And they just couldn't understand my attitudes at all.
Well, thank you for sharing with us, Jim. That's interesting. And everybody else or stories. Wanda, last comment, we gotta close.
Say, Frederick Douglass, I think the PBS documentary is on tonight, or later tonight. So you may look for that before your presentation. We can educate ourselves a little bit.
Good prep.
Well, thank you, Ron, for, excuse me, for another great presentation. Thank you,
you, Ron.
everybody. See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.
You want to hear it?